Hey guys, welcome back. It is Bible Scribe. The Anunnaki in the Garden of Eden. Now this is a concept and a view that has floated around the internet for a long time. In this video, I am not as interested, although we will talk about the Anunnaki. I am not as interested in that as I am in how does these ideas come about. I'm not as interested, and we're not going to talk in as much detail about the Garden of Eden specifically, but again, I'm more interested in how do people get to these misconceptions of the creation story, of the biblical narrative. And so that's the focus of the video, although we're going to talk about some of these topics because, for one thing, the modern church, and this is one of, I think, the major failures of the modern church. The modern church does not address topics like we're going to talk about in this video. The modern church is afraid to address the topics that we're going to talk about in this video because they're afraid of the stigma that comes with discussing these topics. Anunnaki, aliens, which is a related topic. And you may or may not know much about these things, but that's the point, okay? And if we as Christians don't have any information or answers for people who have a view of the Garden of Eden that includes aliens and interactions with humans and Anunnaki, and we fail to address it in our culture, then the people who believe those things have no basis for understanding anything different. We have to be the ones to speak out. The church has to answer these questions or the church will go away. And that is part of what I think is happening to the church right now. The brick and mortars are so tied up, and this is just a little rant here, and then we'll move on. The brick and mortar churches in America and possibly around the world, I don't know, I live in America, are so tied up and wrapped up in their system, their organization, the keeping tithes coming in, okay, keeping a good presence in front of all the people. They're so afraid of if they offend people, then they lose revenue, okay? So they're so afraid of bringing up topics that might seem fringe or might seem strange to a vast majority of the people that they don't address these things. And so, and for whatever reason, I think it's a combination of power and money and control, whether they would say this or not, and it's a fear. And so our churches do not address topics that are now, and they don't even understand, these topics are becoming mainstream. These topics are becoming things everybody's talking about except the church. And so I feel it is important to address this type of thing. I hope that in talking about what we're going to in this video, that you maybe reform some of your opinions about these things we're going to talk about. So the reason I decided to do this video is there is a lady on the internet. Her name is Kerry Cassidy. This is Kerry Cassidy. These are, different photos of her from different things she's done. But this is her, and she has been on she has been doing interviews with people and discussions with people as a sort of journalist in the UFO and speculative sci-fi alien secret space program community for decades. Okay, decades. And I have always respected Kerry Cassidy. Her home website is projectcamelotportal.com. And again, this has been something that she's done for decades. Now, in appreciating her work, I do not endorse all the things that she talks about or speculates about, or even some of the people that she interviews. And she has interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. Some of them are completely legitimate people that have come out of secret programs in the government or have seen things and so some of these are very legitimate interviews. If you ever want, on a Friday night, you're bored and you want something interesting to think about, go watch some of Kerry Cassidy's interviews with these people. It will probably expand your mind, at least in the sense of, wow, I never thought about that before, right? You will definitely see something interesting, probably in almost every one of her interviews with these people. And again, I think some of these people she interviews are legitimate and some are not. And some of them say some things that are right and some things that are wrong. I don't think that there's any, we have to be discerning as we see any information. And with some information, we have to be more discerning than others. Well, again, what brought me to do this video is Kerry Cassidy released a video just in the last few days that I'm going to show you a part of, just a very brief part of, that talks about this idea of Anunnaki in the Garden of Eden. And it struck me because she was so adamant that the original biblical narrative that we generally understand, and I will admit there are problems with the way most people understand the narrative of Genesis. They have some misconceptions, but generally, most of Christianity traditionally has had a mostly correct view of what happened in the Garden of Eden, and that it was actually, I wouldn't say literal, but an account of the story of the Garden of Eden, of a historical story, not some metaphor for some other occurrences, okay? But Kerry Cassidy, it frustrated me severely by releasing this video and essentially saying that she's just not going to accept the narrative of Genesis, because she knows there were aliens involved. There were Anunnaki. And just so you have a little background before you see her video, if you don't already know, I just did a search for Anunnaki photos, but a lot of people that study this stuff, they relate. Anunnaki is a word that's out of an old, I believe, Sumerian text that describes some beings that, of course, these writings are so old, no one has a real idea of what was meant, but the community of enthusiasts online secular enthusiasts, has taken this to mean aliens, that it says things about maybe them coming from the sky or something like that. So they're aliens to all the sci-fi buffs, okay, as they hear about those texts. Most of these people, the 99.999% of all the people that talk about Anunnaki online, have not read a single book or text about those Sumerian texts. So they don't know anything about the real texts, nor how to interpret the ancient Sumerian, for sure. And honestly, the texts were so old that even those the scholars that study those texts have a hard time really interpreting them. All they know is Anunnaki, the word seems to mean this kind of thing. It's even less clear than the interpretations of the Holy Bible when people are going to the Hebrew and the Greek. We have a much better idea of those languages. I would say, as far as understanding, we probably have upwards of 95 or higher percentage on ancient Hebrew as far as understanding it and being able to translate it. And I'm talking about the scholars, not me. And then on the Greek side, we probably have a 99% ability to understand what the words mean, okay, in ancient Greek. So, but when it comes to these like Sumerian and Akkadian texts that are super old, and we just don't have a lot of basis for interpreting their languages, it's more in the range of like 70%, 60, 70, I would guess, according to the things I hear about it, okay? And so it's just, it's amazing the obscurity, but then people latch down on things and say, oh, well, if Anunnaki meant sky people or something like that, which I'm not saying it does. I don't honestly remember. It's been a while since I looked at this stuff. They say, oh, well, that means they're aliens. No, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't necessarily mean that. In fact, what do we hear in the Bible? We hear all sorts of talk of angels in Genesis 6 coming down from the sky to the earth to corrupt mankind. So when you have the correct view of the scriptures, you've done your homework, you see the ancient writings that surrounded the scriptures, which I've done. I've read pseudepigrapha, apocrypha, all these different things. And in comparison to the Bible, they seem to support it and add context. And the context we have from the book of Enoch, all these different writings, is that angels were the ones that came down from the sky and interacted with mankind at various points through history, particularly before the flood, but also, as the Bible says, and other writings allude to as well, after the flood. In fact, I've mentioned this in one of my other videos, but behind me on the screen here is a ziggurat from Ur. And this ziggurat is an actual current photo. I photoshopped it to get the lightning and make it dramatic, which is awesome. But ziggurats, I found writings from early Stoic philosophers. I believe it was Philo, if I'm not mistaken, that say that, and this was written around the time of Christ, I think just before Christ, so BC 50 or so, or 90 BC, it was written that these ziggurats that we're looking at in this picture, that the Babylonians would use these. And on top of each ziggurat, you see there's a big platform on top. Well, in this ziggurat, it's destroyed, but on top was a small house built in which they would, at a certain time during the year, they would put a virgin, they would, in a ritual ceremony, bring a virgin to live in that house on top of the temple and to mate with the Babylonian deity, which was an angel, a demon. And this is what this writer, this Greek writer, before Christ came in BC, wrote about the ziggurats. That's what they were for. It was for their ritual, their religion. And at the top, they would essentially have a virgin come and copulate with their angel deity to produce royal offspring, angelic offspring. And so this is not far-fetched. And when we talk about these people online that think that Anunnaki are aliens and you know, these stories about the Garden of Eden we're about to listen to, where they say that it was aliens interacting with Adam and Eve and not God, you can see why they would, not having any background in the scriptures, why they would come to that conclusion. But not knowing these other writings, I mean, it's honestly a lot. It's a lot to know about. If you don't know, then making speculations based on what Joe Blow scientist over here says is going to lead you to misconceptions of what really happened. So let's listen really quick to parts of this video and talk about what Kerry Cassidy says about the Garden of Eden and the Anunnaki. It's this video here. It was released April 21st of 2022. It's called Invasion and Takeover, Kerry's Update. And I'm on Rumble watching this. You can probably find this video as well. Maybe I'll link it in the description for you. But here she is. And so we're just going to start it at this point. I noticed my, hold on just one second. I want to make sure that I'm not, there. I had a color key on that, so it was a little fuzzy. All right, so let's listen to what Kerry Cassidy says in this section of the video.
I'm going to draw your attention to some words that have been said by 107 with regard to the Adam Eve story.
Now, just wanted briefly to mention who this 107 guy is. He's a man who is doing regular updates about our political situation in America, and he always hides his identity, but he is very knowledgeable about the political and global political situation, not just America, but all these other countries. And he gives updates as far as what he thinks is going to occur, and you know, ideas for preparation for Americans. And he also has made mention of the Bible. He is a Bible believer. Okay, this guy 107. And by the way, if you ever see a video with 107's face, you probably are not seeing the real 107. But he's an interesting person to listen to too. But I'm just saying, this is Kerry Cassidy's response to the fact that she talks and follows 107 closely. But 107 has been talking about the validity of the Genesis narrative in the Bible, and she doesn't like that. She doesn't believe that. So this is her response to that.
And let's keep in mind, if you don't mind, that this is a story. I know there are people out there with religious leanings in the Judeo-Christian tradition who want to believe that Adam, Eve were, I guess, real people, and that the story is based on truth, whereas it's actually more of a parable, as is understood. And it has to do with a garden where these individuals are said to have been. And I just want to read you a paragraph to get you to look at it perhaps in a little bit different way. So this is a conventional Bible statement. God created the first man, Adam, then created the first woman, Eve. God put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to care for and nurture the land. He told Adam and Eve that they could eat of any tree, any fruit of the trees except the tree of good and evil. And God warned them that if they ate of the tree, they would die. So let's just look at that. Now, what kind of God would give you a bunch of trees and put you in a garden and then say, don't eat of the tree of good and evil? Now, the tree of good and evil must be symbolic, first of all. And of course, we know about the apple, and that's another symbol, certainly of the female. And then understanding knowledge coming from supposedly the snake. And then we're seeing a God that basically doesn't want you to learn about good and evil. Now, why would that be? When the multiverse, and certainly the polarity of Earth, is all about good and evil. Why wouldn't God, if God is really a God, why wouldn't that God want you to learn about good and evil? So you're told not to learn about good and evil. And then when Eve disobeys and goes, eats the apple, I think it is, a snake comes and or lures her to eat the apple, however that is written about in your particular Bible, whatever you want to say. So in the end, you've got a God telling you not to learn of good and evil. What else is there to learn about? And this is a person you consider to be God. What that sounds much more like is a deceptive individual who wants you to call them God, who wants you to believe they're God, but in reality, they are, in essence, an Anunnaki, which is a race of humanoids.
All right, so that's the main thing that she wants to say, and then she's going to get into more of the alien stuff, and we'll let that run in a minute. But I wanted you first to hear her belief system in relationship to the Garden of Eden and the narrative, the historical narrative of Adam and Eve. And it's funny because her misconception of that story is the same as the explanation of that story given to us by Satanists and Hermeticists and esoterists. They say that God was vindictive and evil, and the Gnostics from Jesus' time say the same thing. The Gnostic sect, it was Hermetic, from Hermes Trismegistus out of Egypt. And they said that the Sabaoth God, meaning the Hebrew God, was the evil one, and Satan was the good one. And Satan gave Eve the apple to try to open her eyes that she could know good and evil if she just take the apple. Or they say, that's another misconception. The apple, by the way, in the ancient text from the Jews, the tree, the plant that she ate from was not an apple tree. It was the fruit of the vine. It was wine. It was grapes. That's what the tree was in the garden that she ate from, the fruit that she ate. And that's in a couple different pseudepigraphal texts, and it's explained very clearly. But it's just funny, we have all these misconceptions. There's no mention of an apple in Genesis. There's mention of fruit, right? I don't know actually how the apple narrative got started, because the ancient texts say it was grapes. It was the vine. But this Gnostic, Satanistic idea is that Satan was trying to open Adam and Eve's eyes to truth, to good and evil, okay? And that God was trying to keep them away from knowing that stuff, keep them from knowing good and evil. Why would mean old God do that, right? And that's Kerry Cassidy's viewpoint, that God was being mean and trying to keep them from knowing true things and keep them from knowledge, etc., etc. So God is the bad guy and Satan is the good guy, right? And of course, that's a Satanistic opinion. And I don't think Kerry Cassidy is in any way a Satanist. I think she's just confused about all the things that she has heard and studied over the years. And she does not have the background in the ancient writings that I do, that I bring to my Bible channel all the time, that support the text of the scriptures and enhance your understanding of the text of the scriptures. Just for instance, what I said about the apple. It's not an apple. It's the fruit of the vine. It is wine. It is the grape. And the interesting thing is she makes this point about why would God keep that knowledge of good and evil? And this is the question that a lot of people ask when, even, myself, I guess, when I first read the story of the Bible, why did God not want them to know about good and evil? That seems strange. Well, when you read a few different texts, so this is where you have to have the right understanding of what man is, or you're not going to get what's going on in that historical narrative. And this has tripped up not only, this is not tripped up just truthers or people online like this. This has tripped up Christians for centuries, because we're so far removed from when those texts were written. And even the nation of God, the Jewish nation, has been corrupted since the times those were written. And so, those writings being written thousands of years before Christ, and then at the time of Christ, the Jewish nation was corrupt. And even now, we know by looking at their society that they're very corrupt. So it's one of these things where we have lost it to the centuries. But there are ancient writings that still talk about that man had a bright nature before he sinned. That when man was created by God through Christ, Jesus Christ did the work of creation for God. That when Christ formed man, he was made in God's image, and that bright nature had a glory that was not like our fleshly bodies right now. Man was different. Man had a spiritual type of body that we don't understand at this point in history. We don't have an example of to look at and say, that's what man was like. It was a spiritual type of body, a special bright nature, as it's called in these ancient texts. He had a glory like the fathers, not the same as the fathers, but similar to. That was what the being made in the image of God meant. We were a reflection of him. Now, when the sin occurred, it messed everything up. And why do you think God didn't want Adam to take the fruit of the tree? He didn't want him to know about good and evil, because man was incorruptible at that point. If God was telling him, if you do this, you disobey me and lower yourself to the material world by eating of that fruit, then you're going to lose something you don't want to lose. And what man lost was his bright nature, his glorified, the way God created him, his essentially the form of his existence. Man's existence before the fall was different. It says in the book of Adam and Eve that after the fall, Adam and Eve were just beside themselves, upset because they could no longer see angelic beings. They couldn't see through walls. They couldn't see through the sides of the cave where they lived at that point. God had told them to just go live in this cave after they exited the garden, and they did, but they were so distraught. It was so dark to them. They said they were afraid because it was dark, and they could not any longer see the angelic beings or God whom they had walked with in the garden. These are the things that Kerry Cassidy and people like her don't understand, and that people online don't understand, and that many Christians don't understand. So when Adam sinned, that bright nature was darkened. And because now man had a knowledge of good and evil, and like Kerry Cassidy correctly said, the nature of the material world is good and evil. Man was lowered. And what does it say in Genesis? It says that God gave Adam and Eve garments of skin, right? Think about that a second. We've always heard that and said, oh, well, God must have, and this is what people preach. This is what preachers say from the pulpit. God must have killed some animals there and taken their skins and given them to Adam and Eve. But that's not what the text says in Hebrew. It says they were given garments, wrappings of skin. Do you know what that really means? And this is in the context of some of these other extra texts. That means that when man lost that bright nature, he became flesh. A different kind of flesh, the material world flesh, the kind that you and I have in these bodies. And so understanding that, you understand why God didn't want Adam and Eve to take the fruit. You are created for a purpose. It is to steward my creation, to rule over it. That's what God was thinking when all this was happening. In fact, God walked with Adam in the cool of the garden before all this happened. Adam knew God's intention for him, and Satan was trying to ruin it. Satan was jealous. And many, many texts talk about Satan and his fall, which I've talked about in other videos. Satan didn't want Adam to do or have the position that God had given to Adam to rule over creation. Satan wanted to. So what did he do? He corrupted Adam to become a part of that creation. To be lowered from his original created state with the glory he had and being made in the image of God, Satan convinced Eve to sin and for her to corrupt Adam with sin, and they both were lowered to the physical world and given garments, clothes. They were given skin, given flesh, and they had to live now in the material world for all time forward. Mankind would be born into the material world. That is what happened. And all these different misconceptions come from not understanding this fact. If you don't understand that, then we get things like Kerry Cassidy's view, where it's like, you don't understand. Why did God not want them to eat that fruit? and know about good and evil, because man didn't know about evil before. He was only focused on doing God's will, this created purpose of rulership. But these other views come out of the misconception of Adam's original state. One of those is the futuristic dispensational view of eschatology, where in some form futurists are thinking, well, Christ is coming back, he's going to fix my body, my broken body. And I hate to say it, that sounds silly, but a lot of people believe that. They believe that they're hoping that before they die, Jesus comes back so he can fix their body and take them to heaven. I hate to break it to everyone on listening to this video, but that's not going to happen. Your body will not be fixed. This flesh will not be fixed. It's going to go into the grave one way or another. Even if Christ intervenes and God intervenes in history, which will mean essentially that this world is dissolved and remade. So your body is going to dissolve along with it. And then he'll take your spirit to heaven. It says in the Bible multiple times, he will give you a new body, a new white garment. And that garment word is not like, it's not always like a tunic or clothing in the scripture. It means the wrappings of your soul. You will get a new body. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 talks all about this. All about it. There's a new kind of flesh that you will get in heaven. There's one kind of flesh on earth. There's a different kind in heaven. So again, but so many people, so many Christians thinking, God will fix my body one of these days. He's just going to fix everything for me. Make it better. Make me feel better. My flesh. Because people are so wrapped up in the flesh and not the spiritual aspect of their lives. Because you are a spirit wrapped in flesh. The other views that come out of not understanding man's original nature is a Calvinistic depravity viewpoint. Okay? And so the prevailing view among most Christians is that man was created in this flesh body, that this body, these bodies we've got were what God created us as. And so when Adam sinned, it cursed this body. See, the emphasis is wrong then. So then they think you're totally depraved. You can't do anything right because you're cursed. You've got some disease of sin on you. And that was Augustine's teaching that filtered up to Martin Luther and John Calvin. That is why that viewpoint prevails today. It had nothing to do with anyone before Augustine, okay? Except some of the Gnostics, okay? The Gnostics had a horrible view of the flesh because they actually did understand spiritual nature of man versus the flesh, but they had a bad interpretation, so they said nothing you do in the flesh matters because it's flesh. So the Gnostics would have orgies, they would live lasciviously, horrible lives, and say it doesn't matter. You're not culpable for that because it's in the flesh. The spirit is totally absolved of anything you do in the flesh. Okay? And that was an incorrect view. God says we are responsible for our actions because our spirit lives through the flesh. Okay? It doesn't have to do with the flesh. It has to do with our spirit. And that is, of course, while we're on earth. After you die, your spirit is separated, and you're going to go to one of two places. That's another story. But so these views come out of an incorrect understanding. Another one is a figurative kind of view of Genesis, like Kerry Cassidy's talking about, where you're like, that you're saying it's a parable, it's not true. And of course, many people take Genesis as a parable because they don't want to try to come against the secular community of scientists who say it's all evolutionary. And so Christians who accept an evolutionary viewpoint will say, oh, Genesis was just a parable, and each day of creation was thousands of years so that evolution could take place. God did evolution, even though evolution's never been proven. It's an interesting viewpoint, but it's all speculative because you don't understand the correct narrative of what's going on in the Garden of Eden. So when you do have that correct understanding, it clears up all these things. Oh, if man had a bright, special, created nature before the fall, then that makes sense why God didn't want him eating of the fruit of the vine, because it gave him the knowledge of the material world system that he was not supposed to be a part of. He was supposed to oversee it for God. And so it makes total sense why God would try to keep him from that. God wasn't keeping him from knowledge. God was keeping him from knowledge of evil. So, of course, God would do that. God created him for a special purpose, a perfect purpose that we were supposed to fulfill in the original intent of God, but was corrupted by Satan and sin. So by that sin, man entered the material world and has now to live in it until his death. I hope that's clear. I have other videos where I go into this detail and more. I hope that if you're interested in this kind of thing, take time and look through the videos on my channel to see there's lots of different information about the nature of man. What is original sin really? What happened when Jesus came? Why did he come? Why did he go to Hades and rescue the people there? Why would human souls go to Hades? And then how do they get to heaven? All that is in these texts as well, and it's explained. And it all fits. And that's why when we come to things like Kerry Cassidy and this alien stuff, if we have the context of those scriptures and an understanding of all those writings, it helps us really understand what's being talked about. I think now's a good time to go on to the next section, and it's just a couple more minutes where she's talking about this alien narrative, and she's going to explain her thoughts on what really happened in the garden. Okay, so let's take a listen now to her talk about the aliens, the Anunnaki in the Garden of Eden.
Is a deceptive individual who wants you to call them God, who wants you to believe they're God, but in reality, they are, in essence, an Anunnaki, which is a race of humanoids that were Pleiadian to begin with and eventually went off on their own and established the colony in Nibiru, which was a roving spacecraft, and then were invaded and taken over by a marauding reptilian species, be it the Draco or the reptilians. And so they are actually a hybrid race of Draco reptilians and humanoids. And so they are the ones who are told about, for example, in the Sumerian tablets, and also repeated by Zecharia Sitchin in his books, talking about Anu, again, a god, someone who believes he's a god, calls himself a god, and his two sons, Enki and Enlil, who he proceeds to give parts of the earth to, and they then take over certain groups of humanity. The saying being that Enki decides to have sex with the women of Earth and then create a hybrid species that way. So giving his DNA to the women in Africa, whereas Enlil is said to be given the Middle East. And what he does is restrict the freedoms of the humans, and that includes their sexual freedom, and basically turns them into people that follow orders.
All right, so that's her explanation of what she thinks the Genesis narrative about Adam and Eve in the garden is all about. Okay, she thinks it's a complete metaphor for all this alien interaction with humankind. Okay, and I understand where she gets that. She has no biblical experience really. You saw what she posted there about the Bible earlier was just a paraphrase of and a bad paraphrase of of the narrative of Genesis. So I know her understanding of the scriptures is limited, especially of extra biblical writings. But I know too all the different peoples that she has interviewed over the decades, okay? And she's gotten all this different information that she's trying to parse without the background to do it in a biblical understanding. And so I don't fault her, but the information, she doesn't have the information she needs to understand it correctly. And it's interesting to me, like, you heard her talking about the interactions of these, quote, aliens. She mentioned the reptilians, which she calls the Draco. Well, it's interesting that, isn't it interesting that there is a type of angel that is called specifically seraphim. And seraph is the Hebrew word for an asp, a type of snake in the desert where the Hebrews lived, the ancient Hebrews lived. And so it is assumed, and rightly so, that these seraphim were considered to look like, in some form, serpentine. They looked like serpents. And so it's just interesting that every reference she gives to an alien type of being seems to have a relationship to angels, the narrative that's already given to us in the biblical and other extra biblical texts about angels and their interactions. She meant, she didn't mention them, but there's the gray aliens. And it's funny, grays, and I just want you to know, I've studied this stuff a long time. In fact, I've read like 30 different books on aliens, the abduction phenomenon, all these different things. There was a time years ago where I was super interested in that, and I was reading everything I could find on it just so I could understand what they were saying about it. Look at the evidence, so to speak. But these gray aliens that people always talk about are so like demons, it's not even funny. In fact, people have had demonic experiences where the demons looked like a gray alien. Gray aliens are said by abductees to communicate by looking at you and communicating through their eyes, telepathically. Do you know what many people for instance, centuries ago said about demonic activity? That the demons, they would wake up at night and the demons would be staring into their eyes and would communicate to them. But they were talking about a succubus or an incubus. So we know that angels and demons can communicate that way. And now here in the 21st century, we have people speculating that, oh, they must be aliens. Aliens also communicate that way. What? We've had writings about these beings, these angelic and demonic beings, for centuries, eons. And now people are saying, oh, it must be something different. It's outworlders, aliens from another planet. That's nonsense. And it's also nonsense to look back at the ancient texts and say, because they said they were sky people, that it is definitely aliens from another planet, when all the biblical texts and all the Vedic texts of the Hindus and all ancient texts from all over the place talk about them as if they were angels. And then we in the 21st century decide, oh, those have got to be UFOs and aliens. Well, there's a place where that narrative came from, but I don't want to get into too much of the faults and foibles of the intelligence community, but that's another story too. The other thing Kerry Cassidy mentioned about these Anunnaki in the garden and some of their progeny and offspring of Enlil and Enki and Eridu, those are Sumerian, quote, gods, which the word God in these ancient texts means a deity, something from above. It doesn't mean what we think of when we say God, okay? But she says these beings came down and mated with humans. Well, we already have multiple texts, including the Bible, that tell us that angels did that very thing. angels came down and mated with humans. And those texts were not being figurative. There are more than just the Bible, and they were all being historical and literal in the way they were speaking about those things. It said specifically, angels came from heaven and mated with humans, period. It's just interesting that because of the lack of foundation, people online go all sorts of places with these narratives, but they all start with, the Bible is a parable. It's not true. They have to start with that, or their whole idea, narrative, context breaks down. But the problem is, too, that they don't actually have the background in even the Sumerian and Akkadian texts that they're talking about to know. The other thing she mentioned was Zecharia Sitchin. Now, I wanted to mention this guy because if you run across Zecharia Sitchin's work, and this is him on your screen, you will find a interesting trove of books that he has written. He has written a series called the Earth Chronicles. And I think he did this back in like the 70s or early 80s. I have read 3 of these books, I believe. I think it's Genesis Revisited. It's not showing me the title, so I'm not going to remember which of the other ones. I think that one on the top right I read as well. These are very interesting books. But you will notice as you read them, he is speculating on all the ancient artifacts. Now, the other thing that's cool about his books is he has visited a lot of ancient sites, and in his books he has sketches of all these ancient relics, which are very interesting and hard to find. So there's a lot of cool information in these books, and so they're intriguing. A lot of people latched onto these books, including Kerry Cassidy, and they think that Zecharia Sitchin has got it all figured out. He thinks it's Anunnaki, that the Anunnaki are aliens from another planet, and they are the ones that came down and messed with humans and mated with females and flew in from outer space. And he thinks that the ancient sites are landing strips for alien aircraft and all this other stuff like that, okay? But almost all of those ideas came from Zecharia Sitchin's work. Even people nowadays that talk about the same types of things, they don't know it, but those ideas came from his work. The problem with Zecharia Sitchin is as you read his stuff, you realize he has done a good job of cataloging the relics and the artifacts that he has seen, but from all the scholars I've read about his interpretations of the ancient texts that he has translated, he has done a pitiful job of translation. Pitiful. And they say, these other scholars say, his work is just, as far as translations of the ancient writings that he talks about, is just plain wrong. Where he translates aliens, it's not. It might be sky people or this or that. Where he translates rocket ship, it's not rocket ship at all. It's more like vehicle. And that doesn't mean anything except something that you ride in. It could be a chariot. I mean, it's just, in fact, I think a lot of those times he's translated it like rocket ship. It's the word chariot. So this kind of thing is why. But if you read on the surface level, of course, these books all claim to be correct. So if you take it at its word and you don't know any more about it, you're going to come up with the types of things that Kerry Cassidy is talking about, because those things are straight out of Zecharia Sitchin's work. And he's been discredited by thousands of scholars all over the place. You can do an easy search on the internet and you'll find all the people discrediting his work. And you read about it and they're like, it's almost so bad that people are like, real scholars are, they say, it's just really bad and I don't really want to talk about it because it's so bad. That's how bad it is. But I won't discount the fact that, again, I think he did a lot of interesting research. Some of it is at least valid in the sense he cataloged a lot of real artifacts, but his interpretations of those things are all incorrect and lead to the kind of thing that we saw now with Kerry Cassidy And again, this kind of hurts because, again, I really appreciate the work that Kerry Cassidy has done on Project Camelot over the decades. And I think there's another guy that works with her that's her video and audio guy. And he's great as far as their work. They do great work, and they have put together a lot of content that has been helpful for me over the years. Just in studying and learning all the different things that are out there. I've told you, and I'll tell you again, if you watch any of her videos, you will at least be interested. It's interesting. But you have to have a very good discernment on you to digest it, because she says things like we just reviewed, that, Adam and Eve weren't necessarily real. The garden narrative was a metaphor and a parable for aliens coming down, and God is evil and Satan is good, and all these things. And that is the lie of the garden. That is the lie of Satan. Satanists right now would echo her story. I don't know why she doesn't see that aspect of this whole thing. She doesn't see that Satanists are the ones that believe what she believes. Gnostics are the ones that believe what she believes. Hermeticists. And those are the people right now that are out there in the elite circles trying to kill people on Earth right now. Again, that's another story. But I just caution you guys, the things that we talked about, a correct understanding of Adam and Eve's bright nature, with which they were created with a purpose by God, to steward the creation, to look over the world that God just formed, to look over the created beings, the animals. He said, go name the animals, Adam. They're under your watch care. Take care of them for me. And so Adam had this supreme job that Satan was so jealous of. Satan had to get in the middle and try to corrupt it, because Satan had just fallen from heaven because he had gone against God when God asked him to serve the man whom he had just created. And so God was like, Adam, don't eat of that tree. Don't lower yourself to the physical plane. Satan's going to try to get you to do that. And lo and behold, Satan did do that. And Adam and Eve did eat of the vine, of the grapes of the vine. And that gave them the physical, that brought them to the physical plane. They had a knowledge of good and evil now, which before it was just they were doing God's will, which was their created purpose. And it was good. It was a perfect plan that Satan wanted to get in the middle of and screw up. And he did. And now we all live through this life. Then our spirit is separated again from our body, and Christ made a way that spirit can then be taken and reconnected to God. Not we do not become a part of God, but we get to go be with him in heaven. And there's tons of texts about that. Tons. And again, in my other videos, I go into all this detail. You can get all that. But I hope this is helpful for you to see how some of these viewpoints get started and how they come about and how they filter out when we don't have the correct understanding of the biblical narrative. And so I hope I've helped clear some of that up, and that this has been interesting. It's a topic that some people will say, Bible scribe your way out there. Where are you going? Come back. Thank you for your attention, guys. God bless you as always.